Welcome to Sleep with History, where the past whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we journey back to ancient times, unraveling quiet tales, forgotten people, and slow-moving events that gently drift into dreams. Close your eyes, relax your mind, and let history lull you into deep, peaceful rest. The Lion of Sparta, an epic tale of ancient Greece. The morning mist clung to the sacred slopes of Mount Parnassus as Lysander, a young Spartan warrior, climbed the winding path to the oracle at Delphi. It was the spring of 479 BCE, and all of Greece trembled before the might of Xerxes and his vast Persian army. The bronze tripod of the Pythia gleamed in the filtered sunlight as the priestess, her eyes rolled back in divine ecstasy, spoke words that would echo through the ages. When the lion of Sparta meets the eagle of Athens, when bronze clashes with bronze beneath the watching gods, the fate of all Hellas shall hang upon a single thread. Victory shall come not through strength alone, but through the bonds that unite the scattered children of Greece. Lysander's weathered hands gripped his spear tighter as he descended the mountain. He had come seeking guidance for the coming battles, but the oracle's words seemed to speak of something far greater than any single conflict. Chapter 1. The Forging of a Warrior. 25 years earlier, in the austere city of Sparta, a child's cry pierced the morning air. Lysander, son of Cleomenes, had been born into a world where weakness meant death and strength was the highest virtue. His mother, Penthesilea, named for the Amazon queen, looked down at her son with eyes that held both love and steel. "He will be strong," she whispered to her husband, a veteran of countless battles. "The gods have marked him." As was the custom in Sparta, the infant was examined by the elders. Strong limbs, clear eyes, a lusty cry, he would live. But his true testing would begin at age 7, when he would be taken from his mother's arms and thrust into the brutal world of the agoge, the Spartan education system that forged boys into warriors. The day came with the merciless certainty of winter. Young Lysander stood in the courtyard of his family's modest home, his small fist clenched around a wooden sword his father had carved for him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone floor as footsteps approached, the sound of iron-shod sandals on granite. "It is time," said Aristodemos, the stern-faced instructor who would become Lysander's teacher, tormentor, and ultimately the man who would shape him into a weapon worthy of Sparta. The agoge was not merely a school, it was a crucible. Boys learned to endure hunger, cold, and pain without complaint. They stole food not because they were criminals, but because cunning and stealth were virtues in war. They fought each other with wooden weapons until their hands bled and their bodies ached, because pain was a teacher more honest than any philosopher. Lysander excelled not through brutality, but through intelligence. While other boys relied on strength alone, he learned to read his opponents, to find weakness in strength and opportunity in defeat. By his 15th year, he had earned the grudging respect of his peers and the attention of his instructors. "You think too much," growled Aristodemos one evening as they sat around a small fire, the other boys having collapsed from exhaustion after a day of combat training. "A warrior acts on instinct." "But instinct can be trained," Lysander replied, his young voice steady despite his fatigue. "The deer runs when it sees the wolf, but the hunter knows where the deer will run." Aristodemos smiled for the first time in months. "Perhaps there is hope for you yet, young lion." Chapter 2. The Clouds of War. The Persian Empire stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea. a colossus that dwarfed the petty city-states of Greece. When Darius the Great demanded earth and water, symbols of submission from the Greek cities, most had little choice but to comply. But Athens and Sparta were different. They were proud, they were fierce, and they would not bow. The first Persian invasion came in 490 BCE, when Lysander was barely 20. He stood with the Spartan army at Marathon, though they arrived too late to join the battle. The Athenians, led by Miltiades, had already achieved the impossible. They had defeated the Persians without Spartan help. The Athenians fought well. Lysander's captain Pausanias admitted grudgingly as they surveyed the battlefield littered with Persian dead. But this is only the beginning. Darius will return, and when he does, he will bring the full might of his empire. Lysander knelt beside a fallen Persian warrior, noting the fine quality of his armor and weapons. These were not barbarians, despite what the poets claimed. They were skilled soldiers from a mighty empire, and they would learn from this defeat. The years that followed were filled with preparation. Sparta strengthened its walls, trained its warriors, and forged alliances with neighboring cities. But always, the shadow of Persia loomed on the horizon like a gathering storm. In 480 BCE, that storm finally broke. Xerxes, son of Darius, crossed the Hellespont with an army so vast that it took 7 days and nights to pass. Herodotus would later claim the force numbered in the millions, though Lysander, who had learned to count as well as fight, suspected the true number was closer to 300,000, still far more than all of Greece could muster. The Persian fleet darkened the sea like a forest of masts and sails. Their army stretched across the landscape like a living carpet of bronze and steel. At their head rode Xerxes himself, the king of kings, in a chariot of gold and ivory, his dark eyes fixed on the prize that had eluded his father. The Conquest of Greece. Chapter 3. The Hot Gates. Lysander stood at the hot gates of Thermopylae, the narrow pass where the mountains met the sea, and felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders like a cloak. King Leonidas had chosen 300 Spartans to hold this pass, and Lysander was among them, an honor that might well be a death sentence. The pass was perhaps 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, with sheer cliffs on one side and the churning waters of the Malian Gulf on the other. It was the perfect place for a small force to hold against a much larger one, provided they could prevent being outflanked. "Why here?" asked Alpheus, a young warrior on his first campaign. "Why not withdraw to the Isthmus of Corinth, where our walls are stronger?" Leonidas turned from where he had been studying the approaches to the pass. The king was past 50, his beard shot through with gray, but his eyes burned with the fire of youth. "Because, young wolf, if we retreat now, we teach Xerxes that Greeks can be made to run. Better that 300 die here than 30,000 die later, broken by the fear that we are not invincible." The first Persian heralds arrived at sunset, their horses' hooves echoing off the narrow canyon walls. They wore the elaborate court dress of the Persian nobility, silk and gold thread, jeweled daggers, and the confident smiles of men who served the most powerful ruler in the world. "Spartans," their leader called out in accented Greek, "King Xerxes, in his infinite mercy, offers you one final chance to submit. Lay down your weapons, and you shall be spared. Resist, and you shall be destroyed utterly. Your city razed, your women enslaved, your children scattered to the winds." Leonidas stepped forward, his bronze armor gleaming in the firelight. Herald of the King of Kings, You may return to your master with this message. Molon Leb, come and take them. The herald's face darkened. You are 300 against 300,000. You cannot win. Perhaps, Leonidas replied with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. But we can make the price of victory so high that your king will rue the day he set foot in Hellas. That night, as the Spartans made their final preparations, Lysander found himself thinking not of death, but of the oracle's words. The Lion of Sparta and the Eagle of Athens. Surely that referred to more than just these battles. But what bonds could unite Greece when they had spent centuries fighting among themselves? Chapter 4. 3 Days of Glory. The first day of battle dawned gray and sullen, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The Persian army assembled in the distance like a vast carpet of bronze and steel, their countless banners snapping in the wind. Xerxes himself took position on a golden throne placed on a hill overlooking the battlefield, surrounded by his immortals, the elite guard that formed the backbone of his army. The first assault came with the morning light. 10,000 Medes and Scythians advanced in dense columns, their shields locked together, their spears bristling like the quills of some enormous porcupine. They filled the pass from wall to wall, a tide of bronze and flesh that seemed unstoppable. But at the narrowest point of the pass, they met the Spartan phalanx. Lysander stood in the second rank, his bronze-tipped spear extending 8 feet beyond the shield wall. To his left stood Alpheus, the young warrior who had questioned their choice of battlefield. To his right was Pantites, a grizzled veteran of 20 years campaigning. Behind them pressed the rest of the 300, each man's shield protecting the side of the warrior to his left, the entire formation moving as one organism. "Hold," Leonidas commanded from the front rank. "Let them come to us." The Persians struck the Spartan line like a wave, hitting a granite cliff. Bronze clashed against bronze, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Men screamed, bled, and died in the churning mass of bodies at the mouth of the pass. But the Spartan line held. For 6 hours they fought, the Persians throwing wave after wave of warriors against the immovable bronze wall of Spartan shields. When the Medes faltered and broke, Xerxes sent in the Sake, mounted archers from the steppes. When the Sake proved unable to break the phalanx, he committed regiment after regiment of his regular infantry. Nothing worked. The pass was too narrow for the Persians to bring their numbers to bear, and the Spartans were simply better warriors, better trained, better disciplined, and fighting for their homeland rather than the ambitions of a distant king. As the sun reached its zenith, Xerxes played his final card. The Immortals, 10,000 of Persia's finest warriors, men who had never known defeat, marched down into the pass with measured step, their golden shields blazing in the sunlight. "Now we shall see what they are made of," Pantites muttered, adjusting his grip on his spear. The Immortals were everything their reputation claimed. They fought with skill and courage, pressing the Spartan line harder than any force that had come before. But they were still men, and men could be killed. Lysander's spear found the throat of a Persian captain, slipped between the bronze scales of an archer's corselet, punched through the cheek guard of a nobleman's helmet. His world narrowed to the space of bronze and iron directly in front of his shield, the rhythm of thrust and recover, the controlled fury of disciplined warfare. When the sun finally set on the first day, the pass was carpeted with Persian dead. The Immortals, those who survived, withdrew in good order. but they had achieved nothing save the knowledge that Spartans could bleed. One day, Lysander gasped as he cleaned Persian blood from his spear point. 2 more to go. The second day brought fresh horrors. Xerxes had learned from his mistakes, sending wave after wave of expendable troops not to break the Spartan line, but to exhaust it. Thracian peltasts hurled javelins from just beyond spear range. Lydian slingers sent stones whistling through the air, like angry wasps. Ethiopian archers, their skin black as midnight, filled the sky with arrows until the Spartans fought in artificial twilight. But still the line held. When the Persians pressed too close, the Spartans would surge forward in a disciplined charge, their bronze spear points carving bloody lanes through the enemy ranks before falling back to their original position. It was warfare raised to the level of art, 300 men moving with the precision of a single weapon. As the second day ended, Lysander noticed that their numbers had begun to thin. Perhaps 24 Spartans had fallen, their places taken by the Thespians and Thebans, who had chosen to stay and die with Leonidas rather than retreat. But they were all mortal men, and mortal men had limits. That night, as they tended their wounds and ate what might be their last meal, a messenger arrived from the Persian camp. He was a Greek, Lysander could tell from his accent, though he wore Persian dress. "I am Ephialtes of Malis," the man announced. "I bring an offer from the great king himself." Leonidas did not look up from where he was sharpening his sword. "Speak your peace, traitor. There is a path," Ephialtes continued, his voice growing more urgent. "A goat track through the mountains that leads behind your position. The king offers you safe passage for your men if you will simply step aside and let his army pass." Now Leonidas did look up, and his eyes were like chips of winter ice. "And the price of this safe passage?" "Only that you acknowledge Xerxes as your rightful king and provide hostages to ensure your future loyalty." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of bronze being honed against stone. Finally, Leonidas spoke. "Tell your master that Spartans kneel to no man save their own king, and he lies buried at Thermopylae with his ancestors. If Xerxes wants this pass, let him take it with honest steel rather than trader's gold." Ephialtes' face flushed with anger. "You doom your men to death for nothing but pride." "No," Leonidas replied quietly. "We die so that Greece might live. There's no shame in such a death." After the traitor had gone, Pantites voiced what they were all thinking. If there truly is a path through the mountains, then tomorrow we face enemies both before and behind, Leonidas finished. "All the more reason to make this night count. Sing, warriors of Sparta. Let our songs reach the ears of our wives and mothers, that they might know we held to the end." Chapter 5. The final stand, the third day, dawned blood red, with the sun rising through smoke from the Persian campfires like an omen of doom. During the night, a force of immortals led by Hydarnes had followed the mountain path shown to them by Ephialtes. They had scattered the Phocian guard posted there and were even now descending toward the rear of the Spartan position. Leonidas gathered his warriors as the eastern sky began to lighten. 300 had become 250. The Thespians and Thebans, who had stayed to fight, numbered perhaps another 100. Against them would come the entire Persian army, attacking from both front and rear. "My brothers," the king began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Today we dine in Hades, but before we go to join our ancestors, let us give the Persians a breakfast they will not soon forget." The men laughed. actually laughed at their king's grim humor. These were Spartans, raised from birth to face death without flinching. If they were to die, they would die as they had lived, with weapons in their hands and curses on their lips. The final battle was less a fight than a dance of death. The Persians attacked from the front in overwhelming numbers, while the immortals closed in from behind. Caught between two forces, the Greeks formed a circle with their backs to a low hill, their bronze shields forming an unbroken wall of metal and determination. Lysander found himself fighting beside Leonidas as the circle grew smaller and smaller. The king's magnificent bronze armor was dented and blood-streaked, his horsehair plume hacked away by a Persian axe. But he fought like a man half his age. His spear took a Persian noble through the eye, reversed to slam the bronze butt into the skull of another attacker, then swept sideways to trip a charging immortal. The oracle spoke truly, Leonidas shouted over the din of battle. Victory comes not through strength alone, but through the bonds that unite us. What bonds? Lysander gasped as he parried a thrust from a Persian spear. We die here, alone and surrounded. Not alone, the king replied, and pointed with his bloody spear toward the northern horizon. Look, look and remember. Through the dust and smoke of battle, Lysander caught a glimpse of distant banners, the owl of Athens, the twin peaks of Corinth, the bull's head of Aegina. The combined fleets of the Greek city-states moving north toward the Persian naval base at Artemisium. They were not dying alone after all. Their sacrifice was buying time for Greece to unite as it never had before. The circle grew smaller. Pantites fell with a Persian arrow through his throat. Alpheus died with his sword in an immortal's belly, and that warrior's dagger between his ribs. One by one, the Spartans fell, but they made the Persians pay in blood for every foot of ground. When Leonidas finally went down, struck by a dozen weapons at once, the remaining Spartans fought over his body like lions protecting their fallen king. Lysander found himself standing over his monarch's corpse, his spear broken, fighting with sword alone against impossible odds. The end came quickly after that. A Persian arrow found the gap between his helmet and corselet, and Lysander felt his strength flowing out like wine from a broken cup. As darkness closed in around him, he thought he heard the sound of ships' horns echoing across the water, the Greek fleet united at last in common cause. His last sight was of the Persian banners fluttering in the wind, but even in death, he smiled. They had held for 3 days. It would have to be enough. Chapter 6. The Eagle Rises. News of Thermopylae spread across Greece like wildfire. In Athens, Themistocles stood before the assembled citizens in the agora, his usually smooth politician's voice rough with emotion as he described the heroic last stand of the 300. They are dead, he announced to the hushed crowd. But their death has bought us something beyond price. Time, and the knowledge that Persians can be killed by Greek bronze. In the crowd stood Aristides the Just, Themistocles' political rival, and the man many considered the finest leader Athens had ever produced. Despite their differences, both men understood that this was no time for political games. The Persian army was advancing on Athens itself, and the city's only hope lay in the wooden walls of their navy. The oracle spoke of wooden walls, Aristides said later as the two men walked along the harbor, watching the Athenian triremes prepare for battle. You were right to interpret that as ships rather than fortifications. Themistocles nodded, his eyes distant. The Spartans showed us how to die with honor. Now we must show them how to live with victory. But first, We must survive what is coming. The Persian fleet was the largest the world had ever seen. Over 1,000 warships from every corner of the empire, manned by the finest sailors of Phoenicia, Egypt, and Ionia. Against them stood barely 300 Greek vessels, mostly Athenian triremes, with their bronze-armored rams and crews trained to fight in the narrow waters of the Aegean. The battle would be fought in the Straits of Salamis, where the Persian numbers would count for less and Greek seamanship would matter more. But first, Athens itself had to be evacuated. The decision to abandon their city was perhaps the hardest ever made by a democratic assembly. These were people whose families had lived in Attica for generations, whose ancestors were buried in the sacred groves, whose entire world was contained within sight of the Acropolis. But the alternative was slavery under Persian rule, and that was a price too high to pay. Xanthippus, father of the young Pericles, stood on the docks as his family boarded a ship bound for Aegina. His wife, Agareste, held their 5-year-old son close to her chest, the boy's eyes wide with confusion at the chaos around them. "Why are we leaving, Papa?" young Pericles asked. "This is our home." Xanthippus knelt beside his son, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because sometimes, little owl, we must leave our nest to save it. But we will return, I promise you. Athens will stand again, and when it does, it will be stronger than ever." As the evacuation ships pulled away from the harbor, smoke began to rise from the city behind them. Xerxes had arrived, and his soldiers were putting Athens to the torch. The Acropolis burned, its ancient temples consumed by flames that could be seen for miles. It was a sight that would scar the memory of every Athenian who witnessed it. But from the ashes of their city, the Greeks would forge a unity that had eluded them for centuries. Chapter 7. The Salamis Gambit. The Greek fleet lay hidden in the bay of Salamis, their bronze rams gleaming in the morning sun like the teeth of some sea monster. Themistocles stood on the deck of his flagship, watching as the Persian armada spread across the horizon like a dark cloud. Even with the advantage of position, the odds were daunting. "They outnumber us 3-1, muttered Eurybiades, the Spartan admiral who commanded the combined fleet. "Perhaps we should withdraw to the isthmus and let them follow us into open water where their numbers count for more." Themistocles shook his head. "Here, in these narrows, we can defeat them, but only if we can force them to come to us." The plan that Themistocles had conceived was audacious to the point of madness. He would send a secret message to Xerxes, pretending to betray the Greek position while actually luring the Persians into a trap. It was a gamble that would either save Greece or doom it utterly. The message was carried by Sisinus, Themistocles' most trusted slave, who rowed across the dark waters under cover of night to reach the Persian camp. The slave told Xerxes' admirals that the Greeks were planning to escape during the night, sailing south to avoid battle. If the Persians moved quickly, they could surround the Greek fleet and destroy it piecemeal. It was exactly what Xerxes wanted to hear. The King of Kings had grown tired of cautious strategies and defensive positions. He wanted a decisive victory, a crushing blow that would end Greek resistance once and for all. He ordered his fleet to move immediately, surrounding the island of Salamis to prevent any escape. But as dawn broke and the Persian ships found themselves crowded into the narrow straits, they discovered that the Greeks had not fled. Instead, the entire Athenian navy was bearing down on them in perfect battle formation, their bronze rams gleaming, their crews shouting the paean of war. "Now!" Themistocles roared, his voice carrying across the water. "For Athens, For Greece, for the freedom of all Hellas. The collision, when it came, was like the sound of the world breaking. Bronze-reinforced prows smashed through cedar planking, sending splinters flying like arrows. Men screamed and died in the churning waters as ships grappled and rammed and fought like living creatures locked in mortal combat. The Athenian trireme Perillus, commanded by the young Cimon, son of Miltiades, drove its ram through the side of a Phoenician flagship, the bronze point punching through the hull like a spear through a shield. Persian marines leapt across the gap between ships, their curved swords flashing in the sunlight, only to meet Greek hoplites armed with the long spears that had proved so deadly at Marathon and Thermopylae. In the center of the battle, Artemisia, queen of Halicarnassus and the only woman commanding a Persian ship, fought with skill and courage that impressed even her Greek enemies. Her ship, distinguished by its purple sails, darted between the larger vessels like a hawk among eagles, striking where the enemy was weakest before dancing away from retaliation. But skill and courage could not overcome the fundamental problem facing the Persian fleet. Crowded together in the narrow waters, their ships could not maneuver effectively. Those in the rear pressed forward, trying to join the battle, while those in front tried to withdraw when damaged. The result was chaos. Ships colliding with their own allies, oars tangling, formations dissolving into confused masses of wood and bronze and flesh. The Greeks, fighting in their home waters with tactics perfected over generations, pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Ship after ship flew, the Persian banners went down, their crews drowning in the wine-dark waters of the Saronic Gulf. By noon, the sea was littered with wreckage and bodies, and Xerxes himself could see that the battle was lost. From his golden throne, placed on a hill overlooking the straits, the great king watched his mighty fleet, the pride of his empire, destroyed by a handful of Greek city-states that he had expected to crush like insects. The sight of his ships burning and sinking, their crews crying out for help in a dozen different languages, must have been like watching his own empire crumble before his eyes. As the sun began to set, painting the water red with its light, the surviving Persian ships fled northward toward the Hellespont. Behind them, the Greeks pulled their damaged vessels onto the beaches of Salamis and began the work of caring for their wounded and counting their dead. The victory was complete, but its meaning went far beyond the mere destruction of ships. For the first time in memory, the scattered city-states of Greece had united in common cause, setting aside their ancient rivalries to face a common threat. The Eagle of Athens and the Lion of Sparta had indeed come together, just as the oracle had prophesied. Chapter 8. The Bonds of Victory. In the aftermath of Salamis, as the Greek cities celebrated their impossible victory, two men met on a beach in Aegina to discuss the future. Aristides had recently returned from exile, recalled by Athens in their hour of need. Pausanias had come as representative of Sparta, carrying his city's gratitude for the naval victory that had saved all of Greece. "Your Themistocles has won us a great victory," Pausanias said, his voice carrying the grudging respect of one warrior for another. "But Xerxes still has his army. He will not give up so easily." Aristides nodded, his eyes fixed on the burned wreckage of Persian ships still washing up on the shore. The fleet was his lifeline. Without it, he cannot supply an army in Greece through the winter. But you are right. He will try once more before he admits defeat. The two men could not have been more different. Aristides was everything Athens aspired to be: cultured, diplomatic, a believer in the power of reason and debate. Pausanias embodied Spartan virtues, direct, military-minded, convinced that strength and discipline were the only reliable foundations for a state. Yet they found common ground in their shared determination to preserve Greek freedom. "Our cities have worked together once," Aristides said slowly, as if testing the idea. "Perhaps we could do so again, in peacetime as well as war." Pausanias considered this for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of bronze and gold. "Spartans do not trust easily," he finally said. "We have learned to rely on our own strength, our own walls, our own spears. But these Persians..." He gestured toward the wreckage scattered along the beach. "They are like nothing we have faced before. Perhaps the world has grown too large for any single city to stand alone. It was the beginning of an idea that would transform Greece. The concept of a league of cities, bound together by shared interests and common defense. It would not be easy. Greeks had been fighting Greeks for as long as anyone could remember. But the Persian invasion had shown them something new, that they were stronger together than apart. Meanwhile, in the Persian camp north of Athens, Xerxes faced the ruins of his ambitions. His fleet was destroyed, his army trapped in hostile territory with winter approaching, and his empire's aura of invincibility shattered by a collection of tiny city-states that should have been no more troublesome than a gnat. "Great king," his general Mardonius said carefully, "perhaps it would be wise to withdraw for the winter. We can return in the spring with fresh forces." Xerxes' dark eyes blazed with fury and humiliation. He had crossed the Hellespont with the largest army in history, had burned Athens itself, had come within sight of total victory over the Greeks. Now he was being counseled to retreat by states he could once have crushed without effort. "No," he said finally. "I return to Susa. You, Mardonius, will remain with the army and finish what we started. Bring me the heads of Themistocles and Leonidas, or do not return at all." It was a decision born of wounded pride rather than military wisdom, and it would prove to be the great king's final mistake in his war against Greece. Chapter 9. The Reckoning at Plataea. The final confrontation came in the summer of 479 BCE, on the plains near the small city of Plataea. Mardonius had spent the winter rebuilding his forces, recruiting new allies from among the Greek cities that favored Persia, and preparing for one last attempt to crush the rebellion that had cost his empire so dearly. The Greek army that assembled to meet him was unlike anything that had been seen before. Spartans marched alongside Athenians, their ancient rivalry set aside for the duration of the campaign. Corinthians fought beside Megarians, Thebans next to Plataeans, Aeginetans beside Sicyonians. It was a truly pan-Hellenic force, united by bonds forged in the crucible of war. Pausanias commanded the allied army, his tactical skill balanced by Aristides' diplomatic finesse in keeping the coalition together. They had learned hard lessons from their defeats, and they would not make the same mistakes twice. The Persian force was still formidable, perhaps 50,000 men, including the sacred band of immortals and cavalry from every corner of the empire. But they lacked the crushing numerical superiority that had been Xerxes' greatest advantage, and they were fighting in terrain that favored Greek tactics. For 10 days, the two armies faced each other across the plains, neither willing to make the first move. Mardonius knew that the Greeks grew stronger each day as more cities sent reinforcements. But he also understood that attacking a Greek phalanx in good order was tantamount to suicide. He needed to force them to come to him to break their formation and allow his cavalry to work. The breakthrough came when a band of Persian horsemen managed to foul the spring that supplied the Greek army with water. Faced with the choice of retreat or attack, Pausanias chose to advance, but the movement was poorly coordinated. The Athenians on the left wing became separated from the Spartans on the right, leaving a dangerous gap in the center. Mardonius saw his chance and took it. With a great shout, he led his immortals directly at the Spartan phalanx, while his cavalry swept around the flanks to attack the isolated Athenian force. For a moment, it seemed as though Persian tactical superiority might yet win the day. But the Greeks had learned more than tactics in their year of fighting together. They had learned trust. When the Spartans found themselves hard-pressed by the immortals, Athenian hoplites left their own battle to come to their aid. When Persian cavalry threatened to overwhelm the Spartan left flank, Corinthian and Megarian peltasts rushed to fill the gap. The battle became a grinding contest of endurance, bronze against bronze, Greek discipline against Persian numbers. In the center of the fighting, Mardonius himself led charge after charge against the Spartan line, his golden armor blazing in the afternoon sun. But Greek spears found their mark, and when the Persian general finally fell, pierced through the heart by a Spartan javelin, his army's spirit broke with his body. The rout that followed was complete. Persian resistance collapsed all along the line as units fled toward the temporary fortifications they had built behind their position. But even there they found no safety. The Greeks pursued them relentlessly, their bronze spear points finding Persian backs as the enemy fled in panic toward the distant passes that led home. When the sun set on the field of Plataea, the Persian threat to Greece was finally ended. The bodies of 50,000 enemy soldiers carpeted the battlefield, while Greek losses numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands. It was a victory so complete that it seemed touched by the gods themselves. But more than a military triumph, Plataea was the moment when the scattered city-states of Greece became something greater than the sum of their parts. Standing together on that blood-soaked field, sharing the exhaustion and exhilaration of victory, the Greeks discovered that they were not just Athenians or Spartans or Corinthians. They were Hellenes, children of a common culture and defenders of a common freedom. Chapter 10. The Golden Thread. 5 years after Plataea, Aristides stood once again in the Athenian agora, but now he was addressing not just Athenian citizens, but representatives from dozens of Greek cities. The Delian League, as historians would later call it, was taking shape, a voluntary association of states bound together by mutual defense treaties and common purpose. "We have learned," Aristides said to the assembled delegates, "that freedom is not something that can be taken for granted. It must be defended, and it can only be defended by those who stand together. The Persians showed us our weakness when we stood alone, and our strength when we stood united." The irony was not lost on him that this unity had been forged by an enemy who had sought to destroy them. But perhaps that was how the world worked. Challenges that seemed insurmountable when faced alone became manageable when faced together. In Sparta, an aging warrior named Demaratos sat in his modest home, polishing the bronze spear that had served him at Thermopylae. He had been one of the few survivors of that legendary battle, saved by a wound that had rendered him unconscious beneath a pile of Persian dead. Now he served as a living link to the 300, a reminder of the price that had been paid for Greek freedom. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, sat at his feet listening with wide eyes as the old soldier spoke of battles and heroes. of bronze-clad warriors who had died so that Greece might live. The boy's name was Brasidas, and he would grow to be one of Sparta's greatest generals, carrying forward the lessons learned in those desperate days when the fate of all Hellas hung in the balance. "Tell me again about King Leonidas," the boy pleaded. "Tell me how he held the pass." Demaratos smiled, his weathered hands gentle on the spear shaft. "Leonidas was not the strongest of us, nor the fastest, nor even the best with the spear. But he understood something that made him greater than all of these. He understood that a warrior fights not just for himself, but for the man beside him and for those who will come after." Chapter 11. The Seeds of Empire. In Athens, the victory over Persia had unleashed forces that would reshape the ancient world. The city that had once been just another Greek polis among many had suddenly found itself at the center of a maritime empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the coast of Asia Minor. Pericles, now a man grown and one of Athens' leading orators, stood before the assembled citizens in the ecclesia, the democratic assembly that governed the city. Behind him rose the scaffolding of the new Parthenon, the great temple to Athena that would replace the one burned by Xerxes' soldiers. It was a symbol of Athenian power and confidence, a statement in marble and bronze that Athens had not merely survived the Persian onslaught. It had emerged stronger than ever. "Citizens of Athens," Pericles declared, his voice carrying easily across the crowded amphitheater, "we stand at a crossroads of history. The victory at Salamis was not merely a triumph of our ships over theirs. It was a victory of free men over slaves, of those who choose their own destiny over those who bow to the whims of kings." The crowd roared its approval, but in the back of the assembly, an older man watched with troubled eyes. Cimon, son of Miltiades and hero of Salamis, had begun to question whether Athens was living up to the ideals for which so many had died. The Delian League, originally conceived as a defensive alliance, was beginning to look suspiciously like an Athenian empire. "We must be careful," Cimon warned his friends after the assembly had dispersed. "We fought the Persians because they sought to impose their will upon free cities. Are we now doing the same thing?" It was a question that would haunt Athens for generations to come. The city that had stood as the beacon of democracy was slowly transforming into something its founders might not have recognized. A maritime empire that demanded tribute from its allies and crushed any who dared to resist. But for now, in these golden years following the Persian defeat, such concerns seemed distant. Athens was entering its classical age, the period that would produce Sophocles and Euripides, Phidias and Ictinus, the philosophers and artists and architects whose works would echo down through the centuries. Yet beneath this flowering of culture lay the iron foundation of military power. The Athenian navy had grown from the 300 ships that fought at Salamis to nearly 400 triremes, each one a masterpiece of naval engineering. The long walls that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus were nearing completion, ensuring that the city could never be starved into submission as long as it controlled the sea. Chapter 12. The Philosopher's Question. In a small house near the Agora, a stonemason's son named Socrates was beginning to ask the questions that would change philosophy forever. Still a young man, scarred from his service in the Athenian army during the siege of Potidæa, he had returned to Athens with a mind full of doubts about the nature of knowledge and virtue. "Tell me, Critias," he said to one of his wealthy students, "what is courage? Is it the same thing that drove Leonidas to hold the hot gates, or is it something different?" Critias, who would later become one of the 30 tyrants, smiled condescendingly. Surely courage is obvious. It is standing firm in battle, facing death without flinching. But then, Socrates persisted. What of the Athenian who abandons his post to carry a message that saves the army? Has he shown courage or cowardice? It was this kind of questioning, persistent, uncomfortable, unrelenting, that would make Socrates famous throughout the Greek world and eventually cost him his life. But for now, he was simply another citizen of Athens, trying to understand the world that the Persian Wars had created. The Athens of Socrates' youth was a city intoxicated with its own success. The tribute from the Delian League filled the treasury, allowing for the construction of magnificent buildings and the patronage of artists and poets. The democracy that had emerged from the Persian crisis was more robust than ever, with citizens participating directly in decisions that affected their lives and those of their allies. Yet there were troubling signs for those who cared to look. The alliance with Sparta, forged in the crucible of war, was beginning to strain under the pressures of peacetime politics. The two cities represented fundamentally different visions of what Greece should be. Athens looking outward toward the sea and the possibilities of trade and empire. Sparta looking inward toward the virtues of discipline and tradition. In Sparta itself, King Archidamus pondered the reports from his spies in Athens. The city that had once been Sparta's ally was becoming something new and potentially dangerous. A democracy with imperial ambitions, a naval power that could project force across the entire Aegean. They forget, he told his council of elders, that freedom is not something you can impose upon others. The Athenians claim to liberate the cities they conquer, but liberation at the point of a spear is still conquest. The old men nodded gravely. They had lived through the Persian Wars, had seen what happened when a great empire grew too confident in its own power. The parallels between Xerxes' Persia and Pericles' Athens were becoming uncomfortably clear. Chapter 13. The Weight of Glory. 25 years had passed since Plataea, and the generation that had fought the Persians was beginning to pass from the scene. In Athens, Pericles stood at the height of his power, the undisputed leader of a city that had become the cultural and political center of the Greek world. But with that power came responsibilities that weighed heavily on his shoulders. The Great Plague had struck Athens the previous year, killing perhaps a third of the population and leaving the survivors shaken and demoralized. Among the dead was Pericles' own son, Paralus, named for the ship that had fought so valiantly at Salamis. The funeral oration that Pericles delivered for the victims would be remembered as one of the greatest speeches in history. But those who knew him well could see how the loss had aged him. "We do not copy our neighbors," he had said, standing before the mass grave that held thousands of Athenian citizens, "but are an example to them. Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves." The words were noble, but they rang hollow to those who remembered the idealism of the early days following the Persian defeat. Athens had indeed become an example to others, an example of how quickly a democracy could transform into an empire, how easily the liberators could become the oppressors. In the harbor at Piraeus, ships arrived daily carrying tribute from the subject cities of the Delian League. Gold and silver, grain and timber, slaves and manufactured goods, all flowed into Athens like rivers feeding a mighty lake. The city had never been wealthier, but wealth had brought its own problems. The citizens had grown accustomed to luxury, to the theaters and festivals that tribute money made possible. They expected their leaders to provide for their comfort, to ensure that Athens remained prosperous and powerful. But they showed little interest in the moral questions that had once seemed so important. The difference between leadership and domination, between protection and exploitation. In the gymnasium of the academy, Plato listened as his teacher Socrates discussed these very questions with a group of young aristocrats. The old philosopher was past 70 now, his body bent with age, but his mind as sharp as ever. "Consider this," Socrates was saying. "We defeated the Persians because we fought for freedom, our own freedom, and the freedom of all Greeks. But what have we become? Are we not now imposing our will upon others, just as Xerxes sought to impose his will upon us?" One of the students, a young man named Alcibiades, who would later play a crucial role in Athens' downfall, laughed dismissively. "But Socrates, surely there is a difference between Greek rule and barbarian rule. We bring civilization to the cities we govern, while the Persians brought only slavery." "Ah," Socrates replied with the gentle irony that had made him famous. "And who decides what constitutes civilization? The ruler or the ruled?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the Athenian dilemma. The city that had stood as the defender of Greek freedom was now the master of a maritime empire that stretched from the Hellespont to the coasts of Sicily. The democracy that had once been a beacon to the oppressed was now itself the oppressor, demanding tribute and obedience from cities that had once been its allies. Chapter 14. The Spartan Response. In the mountains of Laconia, far from the sea that had made Athens great, a different kind of power was stirring. Sparta had watched the rise of Athenian imperialism with growing alarm, and now the ephors, the elected magistrates who balanced the power of the kings, were meeting to discuss what must be done. Sthenelaidas was the most vocal of the ephors, a man who had fought at Plataea and remembered the price of Persian ambition. "The Athenians," he declared to the assembled Spartan assembly, "have become what we once fought against. They demand tribute. They impose their will upon free cities. They treat their allies as subjects. How long before they turn their eyes toward Laconia itself?" The question hung in the air, like the smoke from the sacrificial fires. Sparta had always been different from the other Greek cities, more conservative, more insular, more suspicious of change. While Athens had embraced the sea and all the possibilities it offered, Sparta had remained wedded to the land and the old ways. But even Sparta could not ignore the changing balance of power in the Greek world. The Athenian fleet could land troops anywhere along the coast, could blockade enemy ports, could strike at will and withdraw before any response could be organized. It was a new kind of warfare, one that favored mobility and wealth over the traditional virtues of discipline and courage. King Archidamus, now an old man whose beard was white as snow, spoke for the moderate faction. War with Athens would be no simple matter, he warned. They have wealth, they have ships, they have allies throughout the Greek world. We must be certain that we can win before we draw the sword. But the younger men were tired of caution, tired of watching Athenian power grow while Sparta did nothing. Among them was Brasidas, the boy who had once listened to Demaratos tell stories of Thermopylae. Now a man grown and one of Sparta's most promising generals, he spoke with the confidence of his generation. "The Athenians are strong at sea," he admitted, "but they have forgotten the lessons of the land. Their citizens are soft, accustomed to luxury and ease. If we can force them to fight on our terms, we can defeat them as our fathers defeated the Persians." The debate continued for hours, but the outcome was inevitable. The same qualities that had made Sparta great in the Persian Wars, discipline, courage, suspicion of foreign influence, now made conflict with Athens unavoidable. The two cities represented incompatible visions of what Greece should be, and only one could prevail. When the vote was finally taken, it was almost unanimous. Sparta would go to war. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe for more, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Sweet dreams.